All right. Well, if you have not seen or heard, LinkedIn has released its 2023 Workplace Learning Report. Now, this is one of my favorite industry reports that comes out every year. I think there's a lot of great insights. This year, I had the privilege of being included in it, but I think there's a lot that we can take away from this. So I thought I would put this together just to share a little bit more about my insights having looked through the reports. And hopefully that'll help you unpack what's in the report, but hopefully also influence the way that you're thinking about what can I actually do with this? Because it's one thing to read research and see what it has to say. It's another thing to go, well, but what should we do with that research? Because if we're not doing anything with it, I did a video last week about this, that just because you consume something, if you're not actively doing anything with it, then you're not really learning anything and it's not really making a change in your life. So the goal with this is to actually have something like this change practices, change things, change the way that you're doing things. So kicking it off. All right, let's take a look at slide number 4, page 4 of the deck on here. And there are the couple things that I think really stood out if you look at the 3-minute takeaway. I'm not going to read it, but there were some things that really stood out on this that if you were just to watch this part of the video, you might be able to just walk from this and go, all right, well, there's some actionable things. The first one is it is chaotic right now. And I think anyone in our industry would fully acknowledge that there's no shortage of chaos with the economic situation, what's happening with skills, what's going on with jobs and the environment. I mean, whatever. The bottom line is, though, that has actually created a lot of opportunity. And so while it can feel overwhelming with all the changes and things happening, it's really worth noting that for our industry in particular, there is a lot of opportunity for us. So that should be encouraging to us, even amidst all the chaos. I think the other thing that from takeaway 2 is a really important reminder for folks is that we talk a lot about skills and for good reason, but it's really important that as we think about this, we are setting expectations that skills take time. So when you're having these conversations with your leaders, when you're talking to folks about the work you want to do with skills, it's going to be really important that you're setting expectations. This isn't something that we're going to change overnight. This isn't something that is going to happen tomorrow. At the same time, I think one of the things that I would personally say is a lesson we can take from this is, and you're going to see this with the trajectory of skills in business right now, we have to move faster. We just have to move faster. And that means stepping away from the traditional L&D approach, always thinking about things maybe the way we have before. Now, the good news is there's a fair amount of tech out there that is actually going to help us with this, which is fantastic. It's going to help us with this. Some of the things you're seeing with generative AI, a lot of other things. But even if you're not stepping into that space, you can be shifting the way you operate to move more quickly and think more surgically about what skill looks like. So I think that's really important that we're setting expectations, being careful because this doesn't happen in an instant. But at the same time, we need to take ownership of saying we need to move faster. We have no choice but to move faster if we're going to stay relevant. As for the priorities, some thoughts on these. One of the biggest ones that I would just really emphasize in here is we have to work more cross-functionally. If in the L&D function, regardless of whether you're centralized, decentralized, federated, somewhere in between, we have to be working outside of our silos. And that doesn't just mean, when we have a project, we engage with these stakeholders. That means being relentlessly intentional. Plug for my book coming out, by the way. But we have to be relentlessly intentional with those relationships and not just transactionally when something's coming up. When it comes to the DEI conversation, one thing I am going to continue to bang the drum on this is that DEI cannot be a separate thing. It has to be fully integrated into everything that we're doing. It's not a training session that happens separate. It's not a skill that you build separately from everything else. It is fundamentally the way we think about the work we do, the way we deploy programs, the way we include people in the design. Everything is tied to that. So that's another piece with that. Digital acumen, I started learning tech talks, and I spend so much time talking about tech because to me, this is critical. If you do not understand the landscape of tech, you are going to struggle. And furthermore, we need to be thinking about this with our employee populations in general. They need to have higher digital acumen as technology continues to become more and more of the air we breathe. Talks about activating people leaders. I want to call this one out, especially early on, because the reality is we need to be so careful with this. It is so easy for our function to think about this in terms of, well, yeah, we're gonna put that on the people leaders to do with their team. And there's some legitimate reasons for, yes, managers play a critical role with their people. At the same time, just even looking at the deskless report from Axonify, managers are strapped, they are overburdened, they are exhausted, and we need to be careful that we aren't just taking things and saying, hey, we did a thing, now you go do all the work. Where can we do as much as we possibly can to help, support, lean in, take those things off of their plate? So yes, absolutely activate people leaders, but we need to do it very thoughtfully, very carefully. And the last call out I will make on this one is we as a function have to be developing. I will echo that one. Prioritize your own learning. If we are not learning, we will never stay ahead of the curve. It will be fundamentally impossible for us to keep up with anything. And so if we're always lagging, there's no way we are ever going to get our heads above water. All right, now I'm not going to sit and go through every single component of this, but there are some things that I want to call out along the way. So I am going to jump ahead to some lessons in this one, and this should be relatively quick. And I know it may sound apparent, but so often we just don't always do a great job at this. And that is we have to map this stuff to what's important to our business. It is not about what we want. It does not matter what learning trend is happening. Even the content of this report, if this report says, hey, we got to be doing this, and in your org, you're going, actually, our priorities are over here, that should take precedent no matter what. And then alignment on that. We have to align. It can't just be us in a silo going, this is what we think that is, and then we're going to go down this path. Going back to that intentionality on cross-functional relationships, it's not just when we're engaging on projects, it's at all times. I think it goes without saying, but it is all about skills. If skills is not in all of your conversations, we need to be doing more to define them. We need to define what that means, because skills is an ambiguous word and it does not mean the same thing for everyone. So if you're throwing that lingo around, some of the greatest opportunity that I've seen in orgs is to actually define what we mean by that. Then yes, obviously, then we need to develop. But the other one that we can't ignore is we have to measure it. And that means starting with the end in mind and figuring out what does good look like in this skill. So if we're going to develop a skill, we have to define and set goalposts to say, this is what development and growth looks like. Here is what success looks like, so that we can measure that and actually see, are we getting that? When it comes to the culture of learning thing, honestly, I don't like building a culture of learning, because the reality is you have one. You don't need to create it. Your people are learning in your organization. They're learning all the time. What I will say, though, and why I do agree that this is a top goal, I don't think you need to create it, but I think shaping that culture of learning in your organization, molding it, refining it, redefining it, being more intentional about the culture of learning, absolutely. And I do agree that that should be one of our top focuses. But I always hesitate when I hear people thinking they need to create something as though it's non-existent, because what can happen then is we can go and we can create in our silo what we think it should look like without actually going back to all the other principles we talked about, leaning into our stakeholders and thinking about, what does this look like through their lens? How do we get that alignment? Well, you don't get that alignment by operating off the assumption that, well, there's nothing here, so I'm just going to start from scratch. The other thing I would say about number 4, just to caution folks with, is remember that retention is the lag measure. I spent a lot of time talking with Ben Brooks about the connection between development and retention, and there is a huge connection, but it's bigger than just because you offer development does not mean you're going to increase retention. And so I always caution people to chase that as a lead measure, or to think that retention should be the goal. If you're doing things right, the data shows you will impact retention. You don't, yes, you should be tracking that, but don't chase retention. Chase the right things. And then from there, what I can tell you is the retention will absolutely follow. So jumping forward a little bit here, a couple things to think about as we look at this one is orgs are becoming, and this should be a quick one. This is a good thing I've seen personally come out of the last couple years. Orgs are becoming far more people centric than they ever have been. And that's a good thing. I think orgs are recognizing that people are not just depletable, disposable resources, and that investing in them, making them feel cared for, caring about the employee experience, caring about development is important. That's good news for us because it means people are starting to recognize something we've been saying for a really long time. So good news. The other good news is they're looking towards L&D. I don't know what your experience has been. My personal experience has been absolutely, we are involved in more discussions. We are invited to more conversations. I think this is a real encouragement. I know I've been a little bit hard on some of the things, the areas that we could continue to improve on, which we should always be continuously improving. But I think this does highlight, and I think we can be happy to see that the org is seeing what we have seen for a long time, but they're looking to us. And that's saying that, hey, over the past couple years, we're doing some of the right things that are helping people see that we not only have the capability, but the desire to actually change the things that are important to our organizations. All right, jumping forward, as we look at this, let me make a little note of the time here. A couple takeaways from the skills that bubbled to the top. Human skills, power skills, whatever soft skills, I know some people hate, durable skills, whatever skill word you want to put in front of that, I think it's really important to note that at the top of the list, companies are looking for human skills. So if your strategy is not foundationally embedded in the bedrock of human skills, you're missing an opportunity. I think that's a really important call out. This should help inform our strategy. Now, going back to my point of being aligned with the business, does this mean that you should just take these things and say, oh, we're going to invest in these things? No, you need to listen to where your org is. You know, you may have some technical skills that may be higher on that priority list. That should take precedent. But I think what we can take from this is that human skills are critical and important to our organizations, and that is just continuing, and that has been consistent. But we are seeing some of these other hard skills starting to rise up. The one thing that I think is an important takeaway for us as we consider this is that if you look at these skills, it's easy to go, there's nothing new about this. And I think that's true. Where I think we need to be careful is because these skills may not necessarily look new, we may say, oh, we've already got that covered. We already have management and leadership training. We already have communication or project management or things like that. We have teamwork, team building. What I would say has changed dramatically over the past couple years is while the skills at their core, I would agree, are timeless, and we may have some things, we are demonstrating, and what good looks like with these skills does look wildly different than it did even a couple years ago. And so this is an important takeaway for us to walk from, is that if we have not refreshed or evaluated what we have in our skill portfolio, we need to be taking a look at this and saying, hey, well, while we may have some leadership training or management training or comms training, is it still relevant given all the changes that have gone on? Are we still developing skills the way that those skills are demonstrated and executed? Even a simple thing like generative AI, that is going to change the way we communicate. And that's going to change some of these other things. That may change the way we do customer service. So while customer service may still be at the top of the list, the way in which that's executed is likely going to change. And so important notation to make on that, that don't assume that just because you have it, you're in a good position and there's nothing for you to do here. All right, jumping forward a little bit more, I wanted to call some attention to the C-suite influence on this. Again, I think this just highlights a positive for us that we have more influence. You know, we've talked for a long time about we want a seat at the table. We need a seat at the table. We want more seats at the table. Quite frankly, I think in some regards, we haven't always deserved that seat. But I think one of the encouraging things that we can take is some of the changes we've made, some of the ways we're repositioning things, some of the value that just inherently has started coming out in people, the need organizations need to invest in people. What that has is it's created more opportunities for us to have a seat at the table. And the influence that we have at the highest level of the organizations is continuing to rise. I mean, you just look at that in 1 year, that's a pretty significant jump in terms of C-suite influence. So I think that again speaks to, while are there continued areas for us to improve? Yes, absolutely the case. However, are we doing some things very well, and is that resonating, and are we seeing the impact of our work through that increased influence? I think that's very, very important to call out. Now, if you're looking at that going, well, that's great, that's what the day says, I don't feel that I'm seeing that improvement. Couple things that I would encourage you to just go back, objectively reflect on as you think about that. The first one is, are you focusing on what your C-suite cares about? Going back to that alignment, are you in those conversations? Are you listening? Are you really getting to the core of what's important to your stakeholders? Or are you thinking more about what's important in L&D? Are you thinking more about what we think is important and the things that we think should be happening? And again, I can't tell you the answer to that, but I would say if you're not seeing this increase in influence, that is one of the first places to check. And that can sometimes be a hard look in the mirror. I think the other thing, though, and this is going to be something you're going to hear me talk a lot more about over the next year or so, is there's an opportunity for us to do more to advocate for ourselves. And that doesn't mean toot our own horn, brag, be that arrogant. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I am talking about is that self-advocation of when we see opportunity, actually raising our hand, leaning into the conversation, and actually making it clear that, hey, we can do something about this and we have something to offer. And I think that self-advocacy is something that if you're not seeing this rise, then that may be something you just may want to evaluate and take a look in the mirror to see, is there more I could be doing? Not necessarily that you're doing something wrong, but is there something you could be doing more of? All right. On this one, the call out I would add to this is really fairly brief in that I think it's just really important to note that we have to pick up the pace. I said that in the beginning of this, that yes, skills are moving and they take time, but we have to move more quickly, which means we need to be reevaluating. How are we assessing problems? How are we designing solutions? How are we executing on those solutions? If we still have a lot of junk in the system, I consistently see this when I talk to organizations, that there's still a lot of fat that we can strip out of there. Now, does that mean people? No, that's not what I'm talking about. But is there room for optimization of our internal processes? I talk a lot about the importance of learning operations and making sure we think like business operators in the work we do. And when you look at that skill trajectory, just continuing to rock up, we are behind. We're behind the curve. Now, granted, don't feel bad about that, because quite frankly, everyone's behind the curve in terms of that. But I think what this shows is there's an opportunity for us to play catch up. And the reality is some of the tech, some of the optimization that we can put into our operational processes. The good news is there are lots of ways that we can be doing that. And so if you're feeling like that's impossible, I would say it's not. There's work to do certainly ahead, but it is within our reach. Okay, on this, I just would quickly call out that as we think about where we spend our focus, where we do this, and this ties back to the retention conversation, people want to connect their learning to their career goals. Now, is this totally on us? No, but this goes back to why we need to have more of our cross-functional partnerships. We need to be investing in tying in with our other talent partners. We need to be invested in with our business partners to understand, what does career mobility look like? What do the different jobs? How are jobs changing? So that we can connect our development to that. Do people like to learn random things? Absolutely. Who doesn't? Who doesn't like to go to YouTube and learn some random thing that isn't necessarily relevant? But that's not what they're looking to their corporate L&D function for. They're not looking to their corporate L&D function to entertain them or to help them pick up some random skill that maybe they'll use here and there, or maybe they're just curious. That doesn't mean we can't be there. But really, where we should be leaning in based on this is we need to help them connect the dots. We not only need to provide the development for them to be able to navigate this career development, but we need to help connect the dots for them. And that's that partnership we're going to have with our counterparts. That's going to be in the contextualization of our development. If we just throw development out there and don't necessarily help people understand, so how does this help me get from point A to point B? If we're missing that, and I see that a lot. So there's something that you can consider as you go back, as you look at this, with number one being progress toward career goals. There is opportunity for us to do more to contextualize their development to their career. So it doesn't just feel like flavor of the week. Here's something, oh, great, L&D's got another learning that we can do. It's actually to be able to say, yeah, yes, we do. And that learning is there to help you get better at this so that you can move into this, so that you can do this. I talked about it again. I'm referencing the conversation with Ben Brooks, but we talked about every company has their hidden menu. They have the in and out menu of how career development really works. And we have an opportunity to actually look at that as a skill and say, maybe we need to do more to help our employees understand what those hidden menus are. How do you order the animal fries at your organization? If you don't have that and people aren't aware of how that works, maybe that's an opportunity that you can consider in 2023 as we move forward. All right, jumping ahead, retention. I talked about this in the beginning. It is a pain point, which you may be saying, is it though, really? It is. And even though we're seeing a lot of downsizing, I continue in my news feed to be seeing this riff, this layoff, this is happening here. Sometimes that can create this culture or feeling of, man, everywhere I look, things are going downhill. Well, yes. And retention is one of the best ways companies can navigate this stuff. And so retention is a natural outcome of the work that we're doing. If we're doing it really well, we are going to impact this. And what I think we can say here is this is a major pain point for organizations. So if we want to, again, demonstrate the value that we can bring through the work we do, well, when we can start connecting the dots and saying, here's how we're tying skills, here's how we're connecting the dots between the skills we're developing to career development, look at how this is resulting in people making the decision to say, yes, it's uncertain right now. Yes, I'm struggling, kind of keeping my head down because I'm wondering when the shoe is going to fall. And I'm still committed to this organization because this organization has demonstrated a commitment to me and my development. And so we can actually help stop this cycle of economic downturn by saying, well, why don't we grow these folks? Because those folks not only have a higher probability of being successful in the organization, they're more likely to get mobilized even amidst a layoff. That the organization may repurpose their skills if they know what the skills are and know where they can repurpose them. But furthermore, we're better preparing them for that inevitable transition if that happens. If they do get laid off, if we've done our job well here, that's going to be a success story instead of a failure story. And again, that's good for our company brand. That's good for a lot of different things. Two more things, and then I will wrap up on this one. The first is on here, as we look at promotions, I wanted to talk about this a little bit in the sense that this overall is something that I think we have an opportunity to influence, is changing not only employees' perspective on this, and this goes back to helping people understand how to order the animal fries at your organization. That can help them start to recognize, you know what? Maybe promotion isn't the only path for me. Maybe development for me doesn't look like moving up. Another big one that I think is a mindset we have to shift is maybe development doesn't look like becoming a people leader. Maybe I want to develop and become a stronger, more reputable, have more influence in my individual contributor skills, which is good for everyone. So I think this is a twofold thing. If we do this right, development does not just have to look like promotions. Now, the takeaway from that is that's going to be important as we measure things. When we start to measure, is what we're doing having a positive impact, we need to be careful that we're not overemphasizing our measurement metrics around promotability, because promotability may not be the right metric to be tracking. Does it mean we shouldn't care about that? Absolutely not. But should we be putting all our eggs in that basket? I would say absolutely not. Now, the other thing I would add to this is we have to be prepared, and this goes back to doing more with our cross-functional relationships. When it comes to this, we have to be influencing and involved in conversations of, what does this look like? So maybe promotion doesn't look like moving up the corporate ladder, the traditional corporate ladder, but we might need to be in those conversations of, well, so how do we then compensate for that? If people management isn't the only way up, how do we ensure that not taking that path means, well, then I'm choosing not to look at financial gain? Because the reality is, these are some of those organizational limitations where we can do everything we can from our end. But if ultimately the only way to make more money is to go this path, even if you give all the reasons in the world and all the development in the world to say, hey, but you could do this and you could do that instead. But if you go that route, you're never going to make more money. Well, then that's going to limit the chances of people taking that path. So again, more opportunity for us to work cross-functionally as we think about this and start changing the mindset around promotions being the only path. Career progress can look very different. Now, the last thing, and I will close on this because I think this is a really, really important takeaway from this, is there is a huge disconnect with the importance of learning. And this goes back to helping us, encouraging us. This stat right here, to me, should be a huge encouragement, not encouragement, but call to action. This should be a huge call to action that there is more work for us to do to try and help employees see that learning is critical to their career. And that also means we need to help managers see the same thing. They need to not look at their employees mobilizing or being promoted or going into other roles. I guess that would be mobilized, but you get the gist. We need to help them see that that's not a bad thing, because if their managers see that as a bad thing, it's going to discourage it in the employees. If the employees aren't seeing skill development as relevant to their career, we see that right here in some of these things. We often hear the excuse, I don't have time for learning. The reality is, I think these stats really highlight it is not about time. And to me, it's never been about time. If you don't have time for something, that is an indication that you do not find it to be more important than whatever else it is that you're doing. So more opportunity for us to continue to lean in, help people see that development is tied to your career success, and help those managers see you don't need to fear this. We need to change that culture of fear. So with that, I would encourage you to go out, download the full report. There's a lot more in there than I covered, but hopefully this was helpful in you thinking about some of the biggest things that you can take away and what can you actually do with this. It's one thing to read the stats, one thing to look at the different numbers and graphs. It's another thing to say, so how does that affect our strategy? So with that, I hope you have a great